a smile at a funeral. But what did it mean? Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Ravela. This community thrives on connection. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your voices make this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. The day had begun with an unusual brightness for late autumn in St. Mary Mead. The little village, nestled between rolling green hills and hedgerows heavy with berries, seemed almost too cheerful for the solemn occasion that brought its inhabitants together. At precisely 11 o'clock, the bell of St. Mary's tolled low and resonant, summoning villagers to the funeral of Colonel Geoffrey Pritchard. The colonel had been, in his brusque and regimented way, a fixture of village life, punctual at the grocer's, imperious with the postman, and invariably critical of parish affairs. Though not universally beloved, he had been respected, and his sudden death, said to be heart failure, was regarded as a sad but unsurprising end for a man of his advancing years. Inside the cool, dim church, whispers rose and fell like the rustling of autumn leaves. Ladies in black with subdued veils leaned close to one another, exchanging tidbits of speculation, while the men, solemn in dark coats, stood stiffly, as though military bearing were required even in grief. Miss Jane Marple, small and neat in her dove-grey ensemble, sat 2 pews back from the front, her expression mild and unassuming. She observed with gentle interest the fidgeting of young Tommy Gates, just the red-rimmed eyes of Mrs. Pritchard, though not so red as one might expect of a grieving widow, and the curious behaviour of Mrs. Lydia Arkwright, who, as the coffin was borne down the aisle, allowed the faintest smile to play at her lips. A smile. At a funeral. Miss Marple's eyes, pale but keen, lingered for just a moment longer than politeness dictated. Few noticed, for Miss Marple had the enviable knack of appearing as though she noticed very little at all. Later, outside the lych gate, the village buzzed with renewed energy, as though the funeral were merely an interlude before the day's gossip. "Quite dreadful, wasn't it?" sighed Mrs. Bantry, leaning heavily on her walking stick. "Though really, I suppose he was bound to go suddenly. Heart or liver, or something of that sort." But Miss Marple remained thoughtful, for while sudden deaths were not uncommon in elderly gentlemen, nor were faint smiles at funerals entirely inexplicable, she could not quite dismiss the expression she had seen on Mrs. Arkwright's face. It had not been relief, nor amusement, nor even malice. It was something subtler, a secret satisfaction perhaps, and secrets in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple knew better than anyone, had a way of leading to trouble. Would you like me to continue with Section 2? The Village Reacts, where gossip spreads and the first flawed theories about the death and Mrs. Arkwright's strange smile take shape. The funeral procession dispersed slowly, like smoke thinning into the clear autumn air. Miss Marple lingered at the churchyard gate, her gloved hands folded neatly over her purse, listening as groups of villagers formed little knots of conversation along the gravel path. It was always at such moments, she thought, that truths half-spoken slipped out more easily than in a parlour or drawing-room. A funeral seemed to give people permission to reveal themselves, cloaked as it was in solemnity and ritual. Mrs. Bantry, who had known Miss Marple since girlhood, leaned toward her with the eagerness of one who has news to impart. "I shall say this, Jane, though it may sound unkind. Poor Colonel Pritchard never inspired much affection. Respect, certainly, but affection? No, not in the least. That Lydia Arkwright, though, did you see her? Positively smiling. One would think she had won a raffle, not buried an old friend." Miss Marple tilted her head in quiet consideration. "Perhaps she was remembering some private joke, my dear," she said softly, though her mind turned the observation over like a stone in her hand, People rarely smiled at funerals unless the reason was rooted deeply in their own histories. Across the lane, two farmers were already in discussion. "They say he keeled over after supper," muttered one, adjusting his cap. One moment he was scolding his housemaid, next he was slumped in his chair. "Doctor says it was the heart. A quick end, they tell me. Quick and tidy," the other agreed. Still odd, eh? The Colonel was a strong one for his age, out in the garden only the day before, barking at the gardener about the roses. Doesn't add up. Miss Marple caught the words but made no comment. Her eyes strayed instead to Mrs. Pritchard, who stood a little apart with her sister, accepting condolences with a faintly distracted air. Her grief seemed practised, carefully measured, as though she were reciting from a script, not insincere perhaps, but strangely cautious, as if guarding herself against too much scrutiny. Gossip thickened in the following days. By the next morning, the village shop was alive with it. Mrs. Hartwell, the grocer's wife, whispered behind the counter, "Mark my words, the Colonel was poisoned. All very neat, they're saying heart failure, but I don't believe a word of it. His cook, Mrs. Finch, swears he'd been in fine health. Ate his pudding, went to his study, and half an hour later, gone." The notion spread like ivy, curling into every household. Poison was such a dreadful and fascinating idea. Domestic, quiet and chilling. The more it was denied, the more eagerly it was discussed. Everyone remembered, with sudden clarity, that the Colonel had had enemies, or at least had made himself disagreeable often enough. He had quarrelled with young Mr. Tom Arkwright over a boundary hedge, fallen out with Reverend Simmons about parish funds, and openly criticised Mrs. Bantry's committee work. Respected, yes, but not loved. Miss Marple, sipping her tea in her neat little sitting-room, heard these theories repeated in variation by every visitor who stopped in to call. She nodded and listened with that faint air of distraction she wore so well, but she filed each remark carefully away. It was not that she believed the Colonel had been murdered, not yet, but she knew that such gossip, though embellished, often revealed truths inadvertently. Human nature, she reflected, had a way of betraying itself in idle chatter. One afternoon, Miss Marple happened upon Lydia Arkwright outside the post office. Lydia was a handsome woman in her early 40s, with auburn hair drawn back tightly, and a manner that always seemed a touch too composed. She greeted Miss Marple warmly, though her eyes held that same curious gleam Miss Marple had noted at the funeral. "Dreadful business, isn't it?" Lydia said, though perhaps not entirely unexpected. The Colonel lived so rigidly it was bound to catch up with him. Still, we must all play our parts in grief, mustn't we? It was a peculiar turn of phrase. Miss Marple, her face serene, only smiled gently. "Yes, indeed, my dear. We each play our parts as best we can." Lydia gave her a long look, as if measuring something unspoken, then excused herself briskly. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind alive with quiet curiosity. That smile, that glimmer of satisfaction. Lydia's words had confirmed what Miss Marple suspected. Here was someone who had not only expected the Colonel's death, but welcomed it, perhaps even planned for it. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. One must never jump at shadows, she reminded herself, but one must also never ignore them. The days following the funeral brought a curious tension to St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself held its breath. The gossip had not abated. Instead, it sharpened, acquiring an edge that hinted at suspicion rather than idle chatter. Though the doctor's verdict had been officially recorded as heart failure, fewer and fewer seemed willing to accept it as the simple truth. When people spoke of the Colonel now, they did so in lowered voices, leaning closer to one another, as if afraid the dead man himself might overhear. Miss Marple, for her part, made no outward sign of unease. She attended to her garden, her knitting, and her customary afternoon teas with the same steady composure. Yet beneath her mild exterior, her thoughts busied themselves with a careful cataloguing of what she had observed. Human nature, she reminded herself, was far more reliable than appearances. The Colonel had not been a man who inspired quiet affection, and it was that very absence of affection that troubled her. Few had loved him, many had endured him, and when many endure a man but do not love him, his sudden death becomes a fertile ground for speculation, and sometimes worse. One afternoon, she received a visit from young Inspector Crail, newly assigned to the district and possessed of a brisk, almost overeager manner. He was tall, with a fresh face, and the air of one who believed strongly in methodical procedure. He had come ostensibly to pay his respects, but Miss Marple could see at once that he had another motive. His questions, though politely phrased, were precise. "You were present at the funeral, Miss Marple," he began, settling uncomfortably in the armchair she had offered. "Did you observe anything unusual? Any reactions out of keeping with the solemnity of the occasion?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. She gave him a mild smile. "Funerals, my dear Inspector, bring out very different qualities in people. Some are genuinely moved, others display what is expected of them, and a few seem curiously detached. But then that is not so strange, is it? People grieve in very different ways." Crail leaned forward. "I've been told Mrs. Arkwright was smiling." Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest nod. A very slight smile, yes, though one ought not to read too much into such things. Sometimes a memory intrudes at the oddest of moments. Still, it did strike me at the time as unusual. The inspector scribbled something in his notebook, though he looked faintly dissatisfied with the vagueness of her reply. "And Mrs. Pritchard herself, how did she seem to you?" "Resigned," Miss Marple said softly, but in a manner that seemed more cautious than sorrowful, almost as if she were careful not to reveal too much. Grief, of course, may make people guard themselves, but I do believe she has secrets, Inspector, and secrets, as I have found, are rarely harmless." Crail frowned, tapping his pencil. "You think there's more to this than meets the eye?" Miss Marple looked down at her knitting. "And I think, Inspector, that when a man dies who was both respected and disliked, one must be careful. Human nature is very seldom simple. It tends to leave little trails, if one is patient enough to look for them." Their conversation ended soon after, but Miss Marple was left with the impression that the young man, though earnest, was inclined toward the most obvious of explanations. He would look to the wife first. Wives were convenient suspects, and if nothing was found, he might be content to leave the matter as natural causes. Yet Miss Marple sensed that this was not the sort of death that could be so neatly folded away. The following morning, she happened to encounter Mrs. Finch, the Colonel's cook, outside the butcher's. Mrs. Finch, a stout, motherly woman, was red-faced with indignation. "It's an outrage. Miss Marple, that's what it is," she declared, balancing her marketing basket. The Colonel was as hearty as any man could be, ate a fine supper of beef and pudding that very night. I tell you, there was nothing wrong with his heart. Nothing. And yet we're expected to believe he just toppled over like a sack of potatoes. Mark my words, something was put in that pudding." Miss Marple asked gently, "And who prepared the pudding?" "Why, I did, of course," Mrs. Finch replied, affronted. "But I'd swear on my life it was as clean as could be. No, if something was in it, it was put there after it left my kitchen. He took it in his study, didn't he? A glass of port, a bit of pudding. Easy enough for someone to meddle then." Miss Marple thanked her and went on her way. But her mind was stirred. Food and drink, yes, they were the natural avenues of suspicion in a case where sudden illness followed a meal. Yet Mrs. Finch's indignation rang true. She was not a woman of subtle ways, and Miss Marple had always found that when such women protested, it was because they genuinely feared blame, not because they were guilty. By late afternoon, as the village once again hummed with theories, a curious little incident occurred. Miss Marple was trimming the last of her chrysanthemums when Lydia Arkwright passed by, pausing to compliment the blooms. Her words were polite, but her eyes darted quickly toward Miss Marple's face, searching for some unspoken acknowledgment. "Such lovely flowers, Miss Marple," she said. "The Colonel was always very proud of his roses, but chrysanthemums, they seem to last so much longer, don't they? Even when one thinks they've withered, they surprise you with their endurance." Miss Marple smiled politely, but in her mind the remark echoed strangely. A woman who smiled at a funeral, speaking of endurance in the same breath as the Colonel's passing. It was almost as if she were testing how much Miss Marple had seen, how much she had understood. And so, as dusk fell over the quiet cottages of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and sat very still in her chair. A picture was forming in her mind, indistinct but persistent, like the faint outline of a photograph developing in a tray. It was too soon for conclusions. Far too soon. But the shapes of hidden motives were beginning to emerge, and Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty that the Colonel's death had disturbed more than the order of one household. It had disturbed the fragile balance of the entire village, and before long that disturbance would ripple outward to reveal truths long kept beneath the surface. The village, unsettled by whispers and speculation, seemed to draw itself into smaller, tighter groups in the days that followed. Every gathering, whether at the post office, the grocer's, or a neighbour's garden gate, inevitably circled back to the Colonel's sudden end. To some, it was merely a curiosity, a story to pass along with the same relish as last season's scandal about Mrs. Weatherby's missing pearls. To others, however, it was something darker, the shadow of suspicion cast upon familiar faces. Miss Marple was not one to chase rumours, but she listened, and listening was her sharpest tool. She had long ago discovered that people revealed more than they realized when they felt themselves among friends, or when they were certain their words carried no consequence. What intrigued her most in those days was not the certainty with which villagers declared their theories, but the subtle unease that crept into their voices. It was not fear of death, that was always accepted with a certain stoicism in St. Mary Mead, but rather fear of what might be uncovered. Inspector Crail, eager to prove his mettle, began his inquiries in earnest. Word spread quickly that he had spoken at length with Mrs. Pritchard, and though no official statement was made, it was generally assumed that she was being considered as a suspect. A widow's position was always precarious in such cases, for the obvious motive of inheritance loomed large in the minds of those who judged from the outside. Yet Miss Marple, in her quiet observation, did not find Mrs. Pritchard to be the sort of woman who would have plotted her husband's end. Her caution, her restrained grief, these bespoke someone afraid, yes, but not of discovery, rather of something else entirely. Miss Marple decided to pay her a call, under the guise of offering comfort. She found the widow in the drawing-room, a pale, elegant woman in subdued mourning dress, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room itself bore the unmistakable stamp of the Colonel's personality. Military prints on the walls, the smell of cigar smoke lingering faintly, and books arranged with severe precision. It was as though his presence still dominated, even in absence. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I do hope you're finding a measure of peace. Such sudden losses leave one quite at sea." Mrs. Pritchard gave a wan smile. "You are kind, Miss Marple. Peace is not something I've yet managed. The house feels—" She broke off, glancing around her as though the walls themselves listened. "Empty and yet not empty. I can hardly explain it." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "When one lives with a strong personality, its shadow tends to linger. But tell me, did you suspect the Colonel's health was failing?" For the briefest moment, something flickered across Mrs. Pritchard's face. Hesitation, or perhaps alarm. He had complained of indigestion now and then. Nothing serious. I never imagined it would end like this." She clasped her hands more tightly, then added, almost in a whisper, "And yet, in a way, it does not entirely surprise me." Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger, knowing well that people often filled silences with more truth than they intended. But Mrs. Pritchard said no more, merely rising to pour tea with careful, deliberate movements. Later, as Miss Marple made her way back through the village lanes, she turned the conversation over in her mind. The widow's fear was not of guilt, but of something unspoken. It was as if she carried knowledge she dared not share, knowledge that weighed heavily, but could not be voiced. Meanwhile, Lydia Arkwright's name continued to surface in whispers. Some said she had been unusually close to the Colonel in years past, before her marriage to Mr. Arkwright. Others recalled the quarrel over the boundary hedge, which had left Mr. Arkwright red-faced and Lydia curiously silent. It was suggested, always with that relish villagers had for speculation, that Lydia might have nursed an old grievance. Old Miss Marple herself noted that Lydia seemed unusually calm amid the village's storm of curiosity. Where others spoke with agitation or defensiveness, Lydia answered inquiries with poise, her voice smooth, her smile faint. Too smooth, perhaps. It was not the composure of innocence, but of control, carefully maintained. The tension grew sharper when another curious detail came to light. Reverend Simmons, while visiting the Pritchards to offer condolences, remarked later at the grocer's that the Colonel's account books, kept meticulously in his study, appeared to have been disturbed. "It is unlike the Colonel to leave his affairs in disorder," the Reverend said with certainty. "Every bill, every receipt, he guarded them with military precision. And yet, the day after his passing, I saw several papers misfiled, as though someone had rifled through them in haste." The effect of this revelation was immediate. Theories shifted swiftly. Perhaps the motive had been financial. Perhaps someone had sought to conceal a debt, a misappropriation, or some damaging correspondence. Villagers nodded gravely, confident now that the Colonel's death had not been natural. Miss Marple, listening as she sat quietly in the corner of the grocer's shop, allowed the idea to settle. She had always trusted in the small things, the minor irregularities that others dismissed. Disorder in the Colonel's study, yes, that was significant. The Colonel's life had been rigidly ordered, his papers neatly marshalled. A disturbance there could hardly be accidental. That evening, as she sat by the fire with her knitting, Miss Marple recalled Lydia Arkwright's remark about endurance, about flowers that outlast expectation. It was not only a curious choice of words, it was also a reflection of Lydia herself, a woman who, beneath her composure, seemed to draw strength from something hidden. The Colonel's death had given her that strength, Miss Marple was certain of it. The question that remained was whether she had simply welcomed fate, or nudged it into being. The shadows lengthened, the village murmured, and Miss Marple calm and patient, waited. Human nature, she knew, could never conceal itself for long. One careless word, one unintended glance, and the truth would show itself. And when it did, she would be ready to see it. The unease in the village seemed to settle like a mist, not thick enough to obscure daily life, but present all the same, clinging to every conversation. People went about their errands, but beneath their pleasantries lay a nervous watchfulness, as though each glance carried a hidden question. Who among us had reason to wish the Colonel dead? The talk of disturbed papers in his study had given the gossips new material, and in the absence of facts, speculation flourished. Some insisted it must have been a servant seizing the chance to hide theft. Others thought it was his widow, desperate to conceal a debt or to protect her own reputation. Miss Marple, however, thought differently. She had known the Colonel long enough to understand his habits. He was a man who sought to control, who ordered his household with military precision, and kept both family and servants under his scrutiny. Such men seldom inspired loyalty. If his papers had been disturbed after his death, it was unlikely to be by his widow, who moved through life carefully, like a woman treading on glass. It was more probable that someone else had gone to the study, not to protect the Colonel's secrets, but to uncover them. The matter became more intriguing when Inspector Crail, still eager to impress, paid Miss Marple another visit. He came briskly, carrying a notebook and the look of a man who hoped at last to pin his case upon someone. "We've found something, Miss Marple," he announced almost triumphantly. Among the Colonel's papers, letters, not recent but enough to cause a stir. Correspondence with Mrs. Lydia Arkwright. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her expression mild. "Indeed, how very interesting. Letters of a personal nature," the inspector continued, lowering his voice slightly, though the pride of discovery shone in his tone. "Not incriminating, but intimate. It seems years ago, before her marriage, she and the Colonel were rather more than friends, a matter, one imagines, that both preferred to keep private. Now that raises questions, doesn't it?" Miss Marple's eyes were calm, though within her mind the pieces shifted. A smile at a funeral, words about endurance, and now letters tying her past to the man who had died so suddenly. Yes, it fit a certain pattern, though not necessarily the one the inspector expected. "I take it," she said gently, "that Mrs. Arkwright has been questioned." Crail nodded. "Naturally. She admits the correspondence, but insists it was long over, forgotten. Still, if she feared exposure, or if her husband discovered it, the motive is clear. She benefits not directly in money, perhaps, but in reputation. Secrets are dangerous things, Miss Marple. When threatened, people do desperate acts to keep them buried." Miss Marple agreed softly, though her thoughts lingered on the subtleties he missed. Reputation was indeed a powerful force, but Lydia Arkwright had not seemed afraid when Miss Marple spoke with her. On the contrary, she had seemed composed, even quietly satisfied. Fear did not explain her smile. It was something else. That evening, as she walked back from a visit to Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple happened upon Lydia herself. The woman stood by the lane, speaking in hushed tones with her husband. Mr. Arkwright's face was flushed with anger, his gestures sharp and impatient, while Lydia remained cool, her arms folded. As Miss Marple drew near, the conversation ceased abruptly, and Lydia greeted her with a polite smile, though her husband muttered something under his breath and strode off without acknowledgment. "A fine evening, Miss Marple," Lydia said, her voice smooth, "betraying nothing of the quarrel. Indeed, my dear, autumn does lend the air a certain clarity, don't you think?" "Yes," Lydia said with a faint smile. "Clarity. That is something we all seek, isn't it?" There was a weight in the words, and Miss Marple tucked them away carefully. Clarity, yes, but clarity for whom and of what? Later still, as darkness settled over the village, Miss Marple reflected on all she had gathered. A widow cautious and fearful, a cook indignant but honest, a young inspector eager for an easy answer, and a woman who smiled at a funeral, with old letters tying her to the man who had died. The picture was forming, though still blurred at the edges. But it was not until the next morning, when word spread that someone had broken into the Colonel's study again, that Miss Marple felt the true shape of the matter begin to emerge. The desk had been rifled, drawers pulled open, as though the first search had not yielded what the intruder desired. The police were quick to ascribe it to common burglary, but Miss Marple knew better. No burglar in St. Mary Mead would trouble himself with old papers and ledgers. This was someone looking for something very specific, something the Colonel had left behind that was dangerous still. And so, as the village hummed with yet more rumour, Miss Marple sat quietly by her fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, her mind sharper than the steel in her hands. Someone in St. Mary Mead was growing desperate, and desperation, in her long experience, was always the final crack before the truth revealed itself. The news of the second disturbance in the Colonel's study sent a ripple through the village that was sharper, more urgent than before. People who had treated the first rumour as idle talk now spoke in hushed voices with real fear. It was no longer merely a matter of heart failure or whispered poison. Someone had been inside the Colonel's house after his death, searching with determination. The idea unsettled the villagers, for it meant that the Colonel's passing had not closed the chapter as neatly as they had thought. Something lingered, and that something was dangerous enough to risk discovery. Inspector Crail made much of the matter, striding through the village with an air of authority, and announcing at the inn that he was closing in on the culprit. He spoke confidently of thieves who had known the Colonel's reputation for wealth, suggesting they sought some hidden valuables. His words soothed some, but Miss Marple, listening quietly in her usual unobtrusive way, was not reassured. Thieves did not return twice in search of trinkets. No, this was different. Whoever searched the study was not hunting money, but knowledge. That evening Miss Marple received a visit from Mrs. Bantry, who arrived breathless with news. "My dear Jane, you won't believe it, though perhaps you will, for you always seem to. Lydia Arkwright was seen near the Colonel's house last night. Mr. Jenkins, who lives opposite, swears he caught sight of her cloak as she walked swiftly past the gate, just about the time they say the break-in occurred." Miss Marple poured her friend tea and listened with a placid expression. "People often see what they expect to see, Dolly," she said gently. "But if Lydia was there, we must ask ourselves why. It is not always what it seems. Why, indeed?" Mrs. Bantry cried, clearly delighted with the drama. "Perhaps she sought to recover those letters before the police found them. Imagine the scandal if they became public. Oh, Jane, it seems perfectly clear to me. Perfectly clear to me. Perfect." Miss Marple smiled faintly, but her thoughts were far from settled. Scandal, yes, but Lydia had shown no fear when the letters were discovered. If anything, she had seemed more secure, more certain of herself. That was not the behaviour of a woman desperate to conceal the past. It suggested, rather, someone with a purpose yet unrevealed. The following day, Miss Marple made her way discreetly to the Pritchard home. She had no official reason to be there, but she always found ways of entering where observation might prove useful. Mrs. Pritchard received her kindly enough, though she looked paler than before, as though the strain of events pressed heavily upon her. "I cannot rest, Miss Marple," she confessed, wringing her hands. "Since Geoffrey's death, it feels as if eyes are upon me always. The inspector's questions, the villagers' whispers. I scarcely dare step outside. Miss Marple patted her hand. The eyes are curious, my dear, but curiosity is rarely harmful. It is when people are silent that one ought to worry. Silence hides more than words ever could. Mrs. Pritchard gave her a startled glance, as if the remark struck too close to her own fears. I do not know what Geoffrey kept in his study, she said after a pause. He was secretive about his papers, always locking drawers and cabinets. Sometimes I wondered if he meant to protect me, or to protect himself. It was an odd remark, and Miss Marple considered it carefully. A man like the Colonel, stern and controlling, might very well have held things back, not out of care for others, but to maintain his power. If something among those papers threatened his reputation, or revealed a past indiscretion, that might explain the desperate search after his death. As Miss Marple left the house, she encountered Lydia Arkwright approaching along the lane. Lydia's expression was composed as ever, but her eyes carried a brightness that betrayed tension. She paused, offering Miss Marple a polite smile. I was just calling upon Mrs. Pritchard, Lydia said smoothly. It is only right, don't you think, that we offer her company in such lonely times? Quite right, my dear, Miss Marple replied, watching her closely. Loneliness is most dreadful when the house itself seems unsettled. Lydia gave her a sharp look at that, as though suspecting a hidden meaning, then inclined her head and continued toward the house. Miss Marple stood a moment longer, thoughtful. Lydia's composure was deliberate, but beneath it ran currents of urgency. It was not the poise of indifference, but of someone calculating each word and gesture. That night, while the village settled into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat by her lamp, knitting in steady rhythm. Her mind, however, was not still. 2 disturbances in the Colonel's study, papers misplaced, letters uncovered, and Lydia's curious behaviour. Each piece formed part of a larger pattern, yet the heart of the matter remained hidden, as though the true secret lay just beneath the surface, waiting for the slightest nudge to emerge. Miss Marple knew from long experience that human desperation always betrayed itself in time. Already, someone in the village was pressing too hard, moving too quickly. The smile at the funeral, the hushed quarrel by the lane, the insistence upon composure. These were threads of the same tapestry. She would not tug at them just yet. No, she would wait, and in that waiting, the truth would soon come forth. The following morning dawned pale and cold, with a thin mist clinging to the hedgerows and the cobblestones of the lane still damp from the night's dew. St. Mary Mead seemed subdued, as though the very air carried the weight of the Colonel's absence, and the whisper of unease that had settled since his death. The talk of break-ins and secrets had not abated, and now there was a sharper tone in the villagers' conversations, an eagerness to assign blame. It was no longer idle curiosity. It had turned into something more watchful, more accusatory. Inspector Crail had begun focusing his attention squarely on Lydia Arkwright. He had the letters. He had Mr. Jenkins's supposed sighting, and now he had the convenient narrative of a past liaison turned dangerous secret. It was enough to his mind to at least consider Lydia his chief suspect. He announced as much in quiet confidence to Mrs. Hartwell at the grocer's, which naturally meant that the whole village knew it by midday. Lydia's name was spoken in tones of scandal, her composure now interpreted as coldness, her dignity as pride concealing guilt. Miss Marple, however, observed with quiet concern. Gossip, when sharpened to a point, could wound as keenly as a knife, and Lydia, whatever her part in the matter, was not a woman easily rattled. Yet there was a difference between composure born of innocence and composure that masked strategy. The village saw only the surface, but Miss Marple had watched Lydia closely enough to know that something deliberate guided her every action. That afternoon, Miss Marple was invited to tea at the vicarage, where Reverend Simmons and his wife discussed the matter with the fervour of those who found themselves in the midst of unfolding drama. The Reverend, usually mild in manner, spoke with uncharacteristic agitation. "I tell you, Miss Marple, those papers of the Colonel's are at the heart of it. I have seen the disorder myself. Bills, receipts, correspondence, all shuffled and misplaced. And among them, curious gaps. Entire ledgers missing, I'm certain of it." Mrs. Simmons leaned forward, lowering her voice, though the house was empty but for the three of them. "My husband is too discreet to say so, but I shall. There was talk years ago that the Colonel had dealings not entirely above board. Investments, you know, with dubious men in London. If such records were among his papers, I should not be surprised if someone sought desperately to retrieve them after his death." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful. That indeed would explain much. The repeated searches, the disturbance of the Colonel's rigidly kept study, and the fear that seemed to haunt Mrs. Pritchard. She said little, merely remarking, "It is remarkable how past indiscretions have a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient times." As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple reflected that the Colonel's reputation for order and authority may have concealed more fragile foundations. Men of his type often clung most tightly to appearances when they had something to conceal. If there were papers capable of exposing him, they might also endanger others, perhaps even those now most eager to see the matter closed. The next development came swiftly, and with it the first true shock since the Colonel's death. Word spread one morning that Mr. Arkwright, Lydia's husband, had been found unconscious in his own garden, struck down by a blow to the head. He survived, but the circumstances were deeply troubling. He claimed he had heard a noise by the hedge and gone out to investigate, only to be attacked by an unknown assailant. Nothing was stolen, nothing disturbed, save for the bruise on his temple and the confusion it stirred in the village. For some, it was proof of Lydia's guilt. Retribution, they said, from her own husband after discovering her secrets. Others whispered that it was Lydia herself who had turned upon him, silencing a man who might reveal too much. Still others, more cautious, suspected it was connected not to Lydia at all, but to the very papers missing from the Colonel's study, as though someone sought to silence anyone who came too close to the truth. Miss Marple visited the Arkwrights that same day, carrying a small basket of broth and bread as an excuse. Mr. Arkwright, pale and weak but stubborn, insisted he had seen nothing of his attacker. Lydia sat by his side, her face composed as ever, though her hands gripped the arm of the chair a shade too tightly. "It was a cowardly act," she said, her voice steady. "But it changes nothing. My husband will recover, and whoever seeks to frighten us will not succeed." Miss Marple, her eyes resting on Lydia's calm face, thought again of the smile at the funeral. Satisfaction, she had named it then, and the word still fit. Lydia was not afraid. On the contrary, she seemed to grow stronger as the village turned against her. It was not the demeanour of a woman cornered by guilt, but of one who knew something no one else did. That night, alone by her fire, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and let her thoughts run free. 2 disturbances in the study, letters discovered, ledgers missing, a widow fearful, a husband attacked, and Lydia, always Lydia, standing at the centre, serene and untouchable. The picture was forming more clearly now, though still the key piece eluded her. Someone was desperate, someone was afraid, but not Lydia. And if Lydia was not the one afraid, then who was? The answer, Miss Marple knew, lay not in grand revelations or dramatic confessions, but in the small telling details of human behaviour. She would watch, she would listen, and soon enough the truth would reveal itself. Desperation had already struck once more in the attack upon Mr. Arkwright. It would not be the last, not be the last, not be. The attack upon Mr. Arkwright, though not fatal, altered the atmosphere of St. Mary Mead in a way that even the Colonel's death had not. Death, after all, was expected of elderly gentlemen, no matter how sudden. But violence against a man in his prime, in the safety of his own garden, unsettled the village to its core. Doors were bolted earlier in the evening, shutters drawn tight, and conversations now carried an undercurrent of fear rather than curiosity. What had begun as whispers about the Colonel's heart now spread into darker suspicions. Someone among them was willing to harm, perhaps even kill, to conceal a truth. Inspector Crail, flushed with urgency, wasted no time in renewing his inquiries. He had Mrs. Pritchard questioned again, pressing her about her husband's habits, his acquaintances, and the contents of his study. He interrogated Lydia Arkwright with a persistence that verged on harassment, convinced that her calmness masked guilt. And yet, the more he pushed, the less he seemed to gain. Lydia's answers were precise, measured, never wavering. If she harboured secrets, she guarded them too well for a man like Crail, eager for obvious clues to penetrate. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, began to notice how the village adjusted to these events. Mrs. Finch, the Colonel's cook, no longer spoke with indignation, but with fear, lowering her voice whenever she mentioned the house. The Reverend grew more severe in his sermons, warning of sin and retribution. Even Mrs. Bantry, usually gleeful in gossip, now spoke with a hint of unease, as though she feared that the story she so enjoyed recounting might end in something too grim for her taste. For Miss Marple, the key remained in the Colonel's study, or rather, in what had been taken from it. The letters had been discovered easily enough, and though they tied Lydia to the Colonel, they were from the past. No, what was sought so desperately must be of greater consequence. Recent, damaging, perhaps threatening more than one reputation. Men like Colonel Pritchard often kept records of their dealings, sometimes even of others' missteps, for leverage. Such papers could serve as protection while alive, but became dangerous once death removed the keepers. Authority! It was with this thought in mind that Miss Marple paid. Another call upon Mrs. Pritchard. She found the widow sitting in the same drawing-room, though her face was paler, her hands twisting a handkerchief. The house felt heavy, not with grief, but with tension. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I hope you are not allowing yourself to be too troubled by all this talk. Rumours can be cruel things." Mrs. Pritchard looked at her with eyes that seemed both tired and haunted. "It is not only the talk, Miss Marple. It is the sense that Geoffrey's shadow has not left this house. Even in death, he governs it. There are things, papers, that I know he guarded closely. I never looked, for he would not have permitted it. But now others seek them, and I fear what may come if they are found." Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly. "Do you know what those papers contained?" The widow shook her head, her lips pressing tight. "No, but I believe, though I scarcely dare say it, that Geoffrey kept account of others' secrets, not only his own. He had a way of observing, of noting things down. It gave him power, I think. And now, with him gone, whoever fears exposure must act quickly." It was a telling remark, and Miss Marple tucked it away in her mind. If the Colonel had indeed kept such records, it explained much. Not merely why his study had been ransacked, but why violence had spread beyond his death. Secrets could weigh more heavily than money, for they bound people with invisible chains. As Miss Marple left the Pritchard home, she passed Lydia Arkwright once more in the lane. Lydia paused, her eyes resting on Miss Marple with that same unreadable calm. "They say my husband was attacked because of me," Lydia said softly. "Do you believe that, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple regarded her with quiet eyes. I believe, my dear, that attacks are rarely about what people imagine. They are about fear. Someone is afraid, and fear makes people do desperate things." Lydia's lips curved into that faint, unsettling smile again. "Fear," she murmured. "Yes, perhaps it does." Without another word, she turned and walked away, her figure upright and composed, as though nothing in the world could touch her. That night, Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts, the knitting lying forgotten in her lap. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting more tightly now. A man dead, his papers disturbed, his widow fearful, an old lover calm, and a husband struck down in his own garden. The heart of it was not poison, nor inheritance, nor even love betrayed. It was fear, fear of exposure, fear of what the Colonel had left behind. Somewhere in those missing papers lay the key, and someone in the village was willing to destroy anything or anyone that threatened to uncover it. Miss Marple folded her hands and closed her eyes for a moment. Human nature, she knew, always betrayed itself eventually. The more desperate the hand that clutched at a secret, the more certain it was to loosen under pressure. The truth was circling closer, like a bird of prey above a field, and soon enough it would descend. The unease that had gripped St. Mary Mead deepened with each passing day. The village that prided itself on its quiet rhythms now seemed fractured by suspicion. Neighbours who once paused for friendly conversation at the gate now cast wary glances, as though every familiar face might conceal an enemy. The attack on Mr. Arkwright had convinced many that danger lingered in their midst, though its source remained cloaked. The police presence was more visible. Inspector Crail striding with determined purpose through the lanes, constables calling discreetly at cottages, but reassurance was scarce. If anything, the air of secrecy and fear grew stronger. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, observed all of this with her usual mild expression. Yet behind her pale eyes, her mind worked carefully, piecing together the fragments others overlooked. She thought often of Mrs. Pritchard's remark that her husband had guarded the secrets of others as well as his own. Men like Colonel Pritchard, with their hunger for control, often believed themselves untouchable because they held knowledge that others feared exposed. But once death stripped away that authority, the knowledge itself became perilous. Who, Miss Marple wondered, had the most to lose if those papers were found? The answer began to take shape during a small, seemingly innocent encounter at the grocer's. Reverend Simmons was speaking with Mr. Ellison, the solicitor from the nearby town who had come to assist with the Colonel's estate. Their voices were low, but Miss Marple's hearing was sharper than most gave her credit for. "An untidy business," Ellison muttered, shaking his head. "Certain documents have gone missing from his files. I had expected a clear record of his accounts, but there are gaps. Loans unaccounted for, receipts absent. It seems he kept private ledgers separate from the household books. Without them, questions may be raised." The Reverend gave a nervous cough. "It is hardly our concern if the Colonel's finances were irregular. What is past is past." Miss Marple noted the strain in his voice. It was the tone of a man who wished the matter closed, not from indifference, but from anxiety. A clergyman's reputation, after all, was built upon trust and moral standing. If the Colonel's missing papers held evidence that even a man of the cloth had erred, the consequences would be ruinous. That evening, Miss Marple reflected upon the connections that stretched between the Colonel and his neighbours. Lydia Arkwright's letters had tied her to him, but they did not carry the weight of destruction. They were relics of the past. Mrs. Pritchard's fear spoke of knowledge too dangerous to reveal, not of guilt. The Reverend's unease, however, suggested that the Colonel's reach had extended further than anyone suspected. Perhaps the missing ledgers contained not only accounts of financial indiscretions, but names, dates, sums, proof that others had depended upon him or crossed him in ways they could not allow to be known. The truth inched closer when Miss Marple was visited the next afternoon by young Mary Finch, daughter of the Colonel's cook. She came shyly, twisting her apron, her eyes darting toward the door as though afraid of being seen. "I shouldn't say a word, Miss Marple," she whispered, "but I thought you ought to know. The night after the Colonel died, I heard footsteps in the house. I was upstairs, and I thought it must be Mrs. Pritchard. But when I looked from the landing, I saw a man going into the study. Not the Colonel, of course, for he was already—" She broke off, swallowing hard. It wasn't Mr. Arkwright either. It was someone broader, heavier. I couldn't see the face, only the shoulders, but he carried a lantern. He was searching and careful not to make noise, not to make noise. Miss Marple thanked her kindly and promised discretion. When the girl left, her story echoed in Miss Marple's mind. A man, not Lydia. Someone large of frame. The inspector had fixed his attention on the obvious suspect, but the true intruder had been overlooked. That was always the way. People saw what they expected, and in doing so missed what lay before their eyes. The following day brought another turn. Mr. Arkwright, though still weak from his injury, asked to see Miss Marple. She went at once, bringing with her a small jar of broth. He received her in his study, his head bandaged, his expression one of strained frustration. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low but urgent, "they say Lydia had reason to kill the Colonel, that she was entangled with him in the past. But I tell you, she did not do this. She is not afraid. She is. Calculating, yes, and proud, but not guilty. The truth lies elsewhere." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "The Colonel kept records. I warned Lydia not to speak of it, but I know what they contained. Loans, favours, even blackmail. He made notes of it all, and now those papers are missing. If they fall into the wrong hands, more than one reputation here will be destroyed." Miss Marple listened, her expression gentle, though inside her thoughts quickened. Mr. Arkwright had confirmed what she already suspected. The missing ledgers were the key, and if others feared their contents, then the motive for murder, and for the violence that followed, was not passion or revenge, but the desperate desire to keep secrets buried. That night, as Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting, she allowed herself a quiet sigh. The net was tightening. She knew now that Lydia was not the only one at the centre of this puzzle. Others, too, had reason to fear exposure, and fear was the most dangerous motive of all. The Colonel had been a man who lived by control, and in death he had left behind a legacy of perilous knowledge. Someone had killed not only to silence him, but to destroy the evidence he had kept. And yet Miss Marple felt the evidence was not entirely gone. Something remained, hidden perhaps in plain sight, waiting to be discovered. She placed her knitting aside and gazed into the fire, her pale eyes thoughtful. It was only a matter of time now. Human nature would betray itself soon enough, and when it did, the truth would surface, however deeply it had been buried. The following morning brought a pale winter sun that did little to dispel the chill in the air. St. Mary Mead, though outwardly serene with smoke rising from tidy chimneys and the faint clang of the milkman's cart, hummed beneath the surface with tension. The conversations in the grocer's, at the post office, even whispered exchanges at church, all circled back to the same thing, the missing papers. Though no one admitted to knowing their contents, the idea of their existence had slipped into common talk, and with it came a restlessness that had not been there before. Every villager seemed to suspect his neighbour, wondering what secrets might be written down in the Colonel's precise hand. Miss Marple moved quietly through this atmosphere, unobtrusive as ever. She paused often to listen, to smile faintly, to offer a few kindly words, but all the while she collected fragments. She noticed, for instance, how Reverend Simmons grew paler each time the subject arose, how Mrs. Bantry, usually delighted with gossip, now pressed her lips tight as though to hold back speculation, and how Mr. Ellison, the solicitor, seemed eager to bring the matter to a swift conclusion. His visits to the Pritchard house hurried and tense. All were signs, small but telling, of people unsettled not by grief, but by fear of discovery. Inspector Crail continued to press Lydia Arkwright, convinced he was on the verge of proving her guilt. Miss Marple listened politely to his theories when he called on her one afternoon, but she knew well enough that his pursuit was misguided. He had fixed on the most dramatic element, the letters, and ignored the subtler signs of desperation that ran through the village. It is always a mistake, she reflected later, to look only where the light falls brightest. One must look in the shadows too. It was in the shadows that Miss Marple now found her clue. She had been invited to tea once more at the Pritchard house, and while Mrs. Pritchard poured with trembling hands, Miss Marple's gaze drifted about the drawing-room. On the mantel, half hidden by a row of silver-framed photographs, lay a small leather-bound book. It was not of the Colonel's usual military or political sort. Its cover was plain, worn with use, and its presence in so prominent a place was oddly careless for a household so recently disturbed by intruders. Miss Marple did not draw attention to it, but the image stayed with her long after she left. That evening she made her way home by the long route, passing the Arkwrights' cottage. Through the window she glimpsed Lydia, seated upright, reading by lamplight while her husband rested nearby. There was no trace of strain on her face, no flicker of anxiety. Instead, her expression was calm, almost serene, as though she had already won a private battle. It confirmed for Miss Marple what she had long suspected. Lydia was not the one who feared the Colonel's legacy. Her calmness was not innocence exactly, but it was not the restless dread that betrayed guilt. The next day brought another disturbance. Word spread that a page of the Colonel's ledger had been discovered, half burned in the grate of the Reverend's study. It was young Mary Finch who noticed it while helping Mrs. Simmons with sewing, and who carried the fragment to her mother. From there it travelled quickly, as such things do, until half the village knew. The charred scrap bore the unmistakable hand of the Colonel. Names, dates, and sums of money. The Reverend's name was among them. The scandal was immediate. Though Reverend Simmons insisted he had no knowledge of the page's origin, the damage was done. Whispers grew sharper, and the once mild clergyman now walked with bowed shoulders, unable to meet the eyes of his parishioners. Miss Marple watched it all unfold with quiet sadness. Here was the proof she had anticipated. The Colonel had indeed kept a record of debts and failings, and those who most feared exposure were already betraying themselves by their actions. Someone had tried to burn the ledger, but fragments remained. They always did. That evening, Inspector Crail came again to Miss Marple, agitated. "This complicates matters," he said. "If the Reverend was indebted to the Colonel, it gives him motive. But surely he would not—" He broke off, frowning. "Still, it does not absolve Mrs. Arkwright. Those letters tie her too closely." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "My dear Inspector," she said, "motives are rarely tidy. One must consider not only who had reason, but who had fear. The Reverend is fearful, Mrs. Pritchard is fearful. Mrs. Arkwright, on the other hand, is not." Crail looked frustrated, but Miss Marple merely smiled her faint, wise smile. She knew the truth would reveal itself soon enough. Fear always drove the guilty to misstep, and the more desperate they grew, the clearer their guilt became. The next morning, Miss Marple walked into the village and found Mrs. Bantry waiting at her gate, her eyes wide with excitement. "Jane," she whispered, "they say another attempt was made last night. Someone tried to force the lock of the Colonel's desk again. Whoever it is, they've not found what they're looking for." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze distant. The pattern was now unmistakable. The guilty party grew more frantic with each failure. The secret, she felt certain, was still hidden, overlooked perhaps in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes to notice. And when it was found, the truth would no longer be denied. As she returned to her cottage, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. The Colonel had been a man who built his life on control, holding others' secrets close to keep them in line. But in death he had lost control, and the secrets had slipped loose into the world. Now the guilty scrambled to bind them again, but it was too late. The truth was unravelling, and soon in the quiet, gentle way she always preferred, Miss Marple would lay it bare. The tension in the village had reached a point where it seemed every household was touched by it. Even the smallest errands were accompanied by furtive glances, and ordinary conversation was punctuated by silences in which unspoken suspicions seemed to hang. Miss Marple, moving with her usual quiet dignity, felt the weight of those silences as much as she did the chatter. She had long known that the truth of human affairs revealed itself most clearly in such atmospheres. Fear made people careless, and desperation often betrayed the hand that guilt tried so hard to hide. The attempted forcing of the Colonel's desk had only deepened the atmosphere of dread. It was becoming impossible for the villagers to believe that the death had been natural, and Inspector Crail, though stubbornly clinging to his belief in Lydia Arkwright's guilt, was no longer able to keep the threads of the case under tidy control. When he visited Miss Marple again, his face was flushed with the frustration of a man whose certainties were slipping away. "They are all behaving suspiciously," he complained. "The Reverend avoiding my questions, Mrs. Pritchard looking as though she will faint if I so much as enter the room, and the Arkwrights, well, they are a tangle in themselves, but the truth must be Lydia. Who else had such clear ties to the Colonel? It was her smile at the funeral, after all, that set tongues wagging. Tongues wagging. Tongues. Miss Marple regarded him gently, her needles tapping in even rhythm. Smiles are curious things, Inspector. They mean many different things, depending upon who smiles them and when. One should never assume their meaning without careful thought. As for suspicion, I should think it is spread rather widely, don't you agree? When nearly everyone has something to hide, the true culprit is usually the one who tries hardest to bury their fear." He frowned at that, but she saw her words unsettled him. His confidence, so unshakable at first, was beginning to crumble beneath the complexity of human nature. That evening, Miss Marple's own thoughts returned to the small leather-bound book she had glimpsed on the Pritchard's mantel. It had seemed out of place, and Miss Marple knew from long habit that such displacements were rarely accidents. A controlling man like the Colonel would never have left a ledger lying in so casual a spot. That meant someone else had placed it there, perhaps without realizing the significance, or perhaps with too much confidence that others would not recognize it for what it was. The image stayed with her, vivid and insistent, as though the book itself demanded to be remembered. The next day brought a quiet but telling development. Mrs. Pritchard, looking more wan than ever, confided to Miss Marple in a voice close to breaking. "I feel as though Geoffrey has not left us, Miss Marple. His presence is still here, not in memory, but in paper. Those dreadful notes of his. They bind the living tighter than his commands ever did. If they were destroyed, perhaps then we could all be free of him." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand over hers. "Destruction rarely brings freedom, my dear. It only shifts the burden. If others suspect you of hiding something, their fears grow larger in the absence of proof. Often it is the plain truth, however unflattering, that clears the air." Mrs. Pritchard said no more, but her trembling hands spoke volumes. She knew where the truth lay, or at least where the missing ledger had gone, and yet fear kept her silent. Fear not only for herself, but perhaps for others who had leaned too heavily upon the Colonel's power. It was shortly after that conversation that the decisive moment began to take shape. Lydia Arkwright called upon Miss Marple, her composure intact as always, though her eyes glimmered with something that might almost have been anticipation. She sat gracefully in the parlour, her gloved hands folded, and said in her clear, even tone, "They will go on hounding me, Miss Marple. It matters little that I did not touch the Colonel. I was linked to him once, and for that they will not let me go. But the truth, I think, lies elsewhere, and perhaps you already see it." Miss Marple regarded her steadily, "And I see only that fear drives people to rashness, and that someone here has grown increasingly reckless. The attacks, the disturbances, the attempts to destroy what cannot so easily be erased. These are the marks of a guilty conscience, not yours. You, Mrs. Arkwright, do not carry fear. That makes you suspect in the inspector's eyes, but in mine it places you apart." Lydia's faint smile deepened, as if confirming what she already knew. "Then you will find them, Miss Marple. Whoever has done this, whoever has brought such unrest, you will uncover them. I have no doubt." The certainty in her voice lingered after she left, and Miss Marple sat very still, considering. Lydia was not the guilty party. She had known that for some time, but now she understood why Lydia's calmness had seemed so strange. It was the serenity of someone who knew she was safe, not from innocence, but from irrelevance. She was not the centre of the Colonel's final web, though others wanted to believe she was. The true culprit still scrambled in the shadows, desperate and afraid. That night, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, a thought struck her with such clarity that she paused mid-step. The book on the mantel, the trembling of Mrs. Pritchard's hands, the fragment of ledger in the Reverend's grate, all pointed not to Lydia, but to someone else entirely. Someone who had feared the Colonel's meticulous notes more than anyone. Someone who had tried not once, but several times to erase them, and who had grown increasingly desperate when they remained elusive. The answer was there, waiting, and Miss Marple knew the time had come to draw it forth. She resolved with quiet firmness that the next day she would act. The truth had ripened. One more small prod, one more gentle observation, and the guilty hand would reveal itself. And when it did, Miss Marple would be ready, not with triumph or condemnation, but with the same calm, unwavering clarity she had always trusted. the quiet certainty that human nature, in the end, could never truly hide what it was. The next morning broke with a thin veil of frost over the fields, the air sharp and still, as though the village itself was waiting. Miss Marple moved quietly through her small routines, her mind composed yet alert. The time had come. Fear had reached its peak, and when fear tightened its hold, the guilty could not help but stumble. She began with a small gathering. It seemed only natural, in the wake of so much unease, that she invite a few neighbours to tea. Mrs. Bantry came eagerly, delighted at the prospect of news. Lydia Arkwright arrived with her usual poise, her husband pale but recovering at her side. The Reverend Simmons appeared late, his face drawn, while Mrs. Pritchard came trembling, her hands restless against her skirts. Inspector Crail joined as well, keen to see what Miss Marple intended, though he affected a confidence that did not reach his eyes. The tea was served with quiet politeness, and for a time conversation wavered between trivialities. Yet it was not long before Miss Marple, in her gentle way, brought the matter round. The Colonel, she said softly, was a man who kept order above all things. Order in his household, order in his books, order in his acquaintances. Such men, I have found, rarely fail to make notes of everything. His papers, therefore, were not mere accounts, but records of secrets. And secrets, I fear, are dangerous things once the keeper is gone. A silence fell. The Reverend's hand tightened on his teacup. Mrs. Pritchard's eyes flickered to the floor. Lydia sat serene, her faint smile unshaken. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm and almost conversational. It was thought that Mrs. Arkwright, because of letters from the past, must have sought to conceal her connection. But she has shown no fear. Indeed, she has been remarkably calm. No, the true culprit was the one who grew frantic, who searched and searched the Colonel's study even after his death, who tried to destroy his ledgers in the Reverend's grate, and who struck at Mr. Arkwright when discovery loomed too close. Inspector Crail leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "And who, Miss Marple, do you accuse?" Miss Marple set down her teacup with delicate precision. It was Mrs. Pritchard, not out of hatred, but out of fear. She knew what her husband's ledgers contained. She knew they could destroy reputations, ruin lives, and hers among them. She could not bear the thought of Geoffrey's shadow stretching on even after his death. So she sought to free herself, first by his passing and then by destroying the records. But desperation undid her. Each act of concealment drew more attention, not less. All eyes turned to the widow. Mrs. Pritchard gave a strangled cry, rising to her feet, her hands trembling violently. "It is not true, I only wanted peace." He wrote down everything, every debt, every mistake, every secret whispered in confidence. He meant to keep us all chained to him forever. Even me, especially me. I could not bear it. Her voice broke and she sank back, sobbing. Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost sorrowful. "Yes, my dear, you smiled at the funeral, not Lydia. You smiled because you thought at last the shadow was gone. But shadows do not vanish so easily. That is why you tried again and again to erase what remained. It was not malice, but fear. Yet fear, alas, led you too far." The room was hushed, but for Mrs. Pritchard's weeping. Inspector Crail, pale and unsettled, rose awkwardly to his duty. Lydia Arkwright sat very still, her faint smile gone, replaced by something like weary vindication. The Reverend looked stricken, though whether at his own narrow escape or at the fall of another, Miss Marple could not say. When it was done, when the inspector had gone with his charge and the villagers departed in shaken silence, Miss Marple tidied the cups with her usual care. The house fell quiet once more, the fire glowing gently in the grate. She paused a moment, looking out at the garden where the last chrysanthemums still clung to their stalks. Human nature, she murmured softly to herself, is the same everywhere. Weakness and fear most of all. Poor creature, she only wanted freedom. But freedom bought with deceit is never true freedom. And with that, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the sharp click of the needle steady in the tranquil room, as though the village's turmoil had been no more than a passing storm, and life, with all its secrets and shadows, was settling once again into quiet order, again into quiet order, again into